Good afternoon. This is Professor Amina Al-Din, moving through the snow with Muslim Network TV on the program Critical Talk. I am honored, and I do mean honored, today to have Dr. Kameelah Rashad with me. She is the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation, and she's the founding co-director of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. Through Muslim Wellness Foundation, Dr. Rashad has established an annual Black Muslim Psychology Conference, and I'm going to get on that list, and I hope you do too, and the Deeply Emerging Leaders Fellowship for Black Muslim Young Adults. Dr. Rashad graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in psychology and an MED in psychological services. She obtained further graduate education with a master's and a PhD in clinical psychology at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. Welcome and salams, Dr. Rashad. It is so hard to catch you. I'm going to put one of those tags in your hand or something. So when I need you and I'm in dire need of therapy, that I can catch you. There are loads of things that I want to talk about today, but I want to get, because there, here in Chicago, there's the Khalil Center, which does not interact with African American Muslims much, whether on the clinician side or with the patient side. And I have to admit, and you can tell me that I'm wrong, I can take it.
Okay.
You take all of the categories and all of the things that you all learn in psychology, and you stick Islam in front of it, and it's supposed to now be Islamic psychology, with the same old dead white dudes running the show. So talk to me about how we could think about constructing Islamic psychology.
So, Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's tuning in. And thank you, Professor Amina, for inviting me. I know that I am busy at times, but I have to stop everything for you. That I must do.
Love it.
So I think, what you mentioned is actually one of the misconceptions about Islamic psychology. And I also think psychology in general, that there is a precedent within our Islamic tradition for an understanding of mind, body, spirit, that, we can't sort of talk about just the intellect without the heart, right? We can't talk about the heart without also understanding the spirit or the soul. And that is our understanding of holistic wellness. So when we talk about specifically understanding the psychological needs of African Americans, for Black Muslims, is also really having a deep understanding of historical and present trauma, but also all of the ways that our communities have been resilient, have expressed joy, have expressed and given and received love. Those are all also attributes that are contributes, right, to a sense of being able to strive for well-being. And so the difficulty, I think, that we have at times, especially myself as a Black psychologist, is the idea of therapy has been so much sort of framed as like a white phenomenon, right?
Yep.
That they have the luxury of sitting or laying on someone's couch and talking about just how they feel. And Black folks are thinking, I don't have time for that. I have to work. That is. But what we rob ourselves of is the opportunity just to process just how the enormous and incredible weight of carrying, right? Just whether it's through the history of enslavement, the trauma of colonization, of immigration. These are experiences that live in our bodies, right? If we're still thinking about mind, body, spirit, that we feel it, right? Even on a physical, cellular level. And so we deserve time to sort of sit and reflect, to thank God, and also to think about what are some of the beliefs about myself that I have internalized as it relates to white supremacy, and what are those things that I need to unlearn, right? That I need to challenge, that I really need to accept about my own sense of worthiness and value. So we deserve all of that.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. When I see stuff in what was that dude's name? Maslow,
Yes, hierarchy of needs.
Freud, and I'm saying Freud was a freak. And I don't know where Maslow got his dogs from, but I'm not signing up. But, and those are the things that you kind of think about.
Mhm.
But you also think about if someone were to get in your head and have you talk about all those microaggressions
Yes.
that you wave off, and you're constantly told you're supposed to be stronger than the biggest tree, and you're wagging stuff around. How do we begin to unload?
Right. I think that's an excellent question, because what I've experienced, as a clinician and also as someone who has been in therapy myself, is that we carry so much of it, so much of the weight of the trauma, and we think, you know what? If I just stop and rest, what if I never get up again? Right? What if I start talking and it sort of the dam breaks, right? And so there's a lot of fear associated with that vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think on one hand, there is legitimate concern about the trauma of white supremacy being perpetuated in the therapy room. And so if you're interacting with a clinician who doesn't have an understanding of your cultural and ethnic and religious background, then they, let's say at the least, will inadvertently, right, harm you, right, with their ignorance, with their assumptions. I've heard people tell me, especially for Muslim women, perhaps it's your religion that has caused this depression. Perhaps,
Exactly.
it's right.
Mhm.
So I think there is a lot of fear around how do I essentially open up to someone who looks like the oppressor, right? How do I open up to perhaps then being deemed pathological, and there's a defection, right? There's somehow a deficit within me. How do I do that to someone that you look like, right, the person who's perpetrated all of these microaggressions, but also real harm to me and those I love? So the question that I encourage those who are seeking therapy to ask is, you can have an initial consultation like any other healthcare provider and ask that person, what are their thoughts about the psychological impact of white supremacy, right, of anti-Black racism, and wait for them to respond, right? Either they'll say, you know what, I haven't given it much thought, but I think it's an important question, or they'll be able to demonstrate their level of knowledge and say that this is incredibly important. But that gives you sort of a measure of whether or not this might be a safe space for you. On the flip side of that, we can't always assume that just because the therapist looks like we do, right, that there is an automatic connection, that there is going to be healing that happens in that relationship. But it may offer like a fertile ground to build rapport and trust. So I absolutely hear, the fear that people have around just the vulnerability, right? And what does it mean to really consciously think about how much pain we bear on a daily basis, the pain that our foremothers and forefathers have borne over the ages. But we also have to believe in our own worth and our own resiliency, and our own healing, right? That this is what we deserve. This is what we are also entitled to, is, lives full of joy and warmth and laughter.
Got that. We're going to take a moment's break, and I'm going to beg you to give
Okay.
us a mini lecture on trauma stewardship. We
Absolutely.
still need it. So let's take a break for a minute or two. And while you set yourself up, to, and everybody in the audience listening, get out your pencil and paper because we're going to school for a moment. We'll be right back. This is Professor Amina Dean, and I have the honor of being with Dr. Kameelah Rashad, who's going to help us out here. This is even free, you know? We'll be right back. This is Professor Amina Dean on Critical Talk, and we're going to get a mini lecture, which is definitely critical on Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Camilla, to talk to us. I got to get my pencil piece of paper.
Okay. Well, thank you again, all of you for joining. I want to talk a minute about this idea that when people ask us how we're doing, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're thinking about all of the stressors, the strain. We're moving into a second Ramadan under COVID. We're thinking about whether or not to vaccinate, who has vaccinated. We're thinking about perhaps those loved ones that we've lost. But this is what I often hear, right? And I'm guilty of saying this myself. Someone says, "Oh, how are you?" What is the first thing we say? "Oh, alhamdulillah," right? I can't complain. However, there are moments when I think we have to be very honest about how we're feeling and what it means for us, what it means for us to continue to carry this load without end, right? There isn't a date that we've been given, like this is a point at which we will be sort of free of COVID. We haven't been given that kind of a surety. So when people ask us how we're doing, we have to identify those in our lives who we can be honest with. Because often, we at least give off the appearance that we're this way, right? Oh, everything is great. I'm just pushing through. I have to count my blessings. I have to show gratitude for what I do have. But underneath all of that, we look like this. We're fatigued, we're burnt out, we're feeling a lot of despair and hopelessness. We're also trying to figure out, how do I keep others motivated that I care about, that I may play a role in sort of providing even stability for them? Like, I'm a mother of teens and a toddler. And so when we feel that we have to carry all of the present trauma as well as those experiences that we've had before, what we often cut ourselves off from is the support and the nurturing and the community that we need in order to get through the next day. And so this is specifically related to clergy, but I think this is also very much related to the roles that we have in whatever capacity. So if you're a teacher, you're a university college professor, you're someone who is an essential worker, we all feel sort of this commitment perhaps to the work that we decide to do. And then at times we feel overwhelmed, right? We feel exhausted, we feel hopeless. Maybe we even feel trapped in sort of the day to day.
Right.
We might feel resentment towards those who need us, right? Because again, it feels like people are tugging at you when you don't have the resources to take another step. But then we feel guilt and shame, right,
Yeah.
about those things, right? That, I love what I do, but maybe I'm just burnt out and I feel unmotivated.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and
Right.
then we're very self-critical. We say, you know what? That is not a good attitude to have. Get yourself together. You don't have time to talk about, what you're tired about, but we invalidate our own feelings. So how can we expect others to validate us when what we experience emotionally has been minimized and sort of set to the side?
Yeah.
So
So,
um, there's there is a way for us to talk about what we're exposed to, right? This trauma exposure response, and this is from a really, really amazing book called Trauma Stewardship. It's always right next to me on my shelf, and it talks about this idea that we are surrounded by suffering every day, right? We're surrounded by joy. There are things that we're grateful for, but we often sort of turn away from the pain that we feel, the hurts, the disappointments, because we don't know what to do with it. But we're surrounded by it, right? It's unavoidable. Um, and so this could, right, be some of what you've might been experiencing over the last several months, right? Feeling helpless and hopeless, right? A sense that you can't ever do enough, right? And I'll talk about that because, and just kind of pausing there for a minute, because there's what's called white supremacist organizational culture, right? Which pushes us to produce, right? And prioritizes production over relationship and connection, right? And so it's not about, who have you spoken with? Who are you, connected to? How are you nurturing one another? But it's, where's that paper? Where's that report? Have this on my desk. Where's your to-do? Right? We have this endless sort of checklist of things we're supposed to do in order to feel that we're worthy, right? And this is a problem, especially now during COVID, because we're trying to adjust to a life-altering event, right? The level of loss, I think at this point in the United States, almost 470,000 Americans have died, right? I don't know about you, but my brain has a hard time wrapping, right, just understanding the enormity of that, right? So almost 500,000 people, right? That means there are at least 500,000 people who are sitting with despair and grief, right? Who are perhaps in shock. But we just continue on our day and pretending like that's not something that's sitting heavy with us. So there might be diminished creativity, right? We're minimizing. Perhaps, your exhaustion manifests in your body, right? So maybe you have a migraine, maybe you aren't able to eat, or you have a loss of appetite, maybe it's stomach aches. But these are all perhaps signals that your body is giving you that there is something more that is happening that we have to name, right, as this trauma exposure. So the idea of trauma stewardship is that there's a practice that we each as individuals can do and in relationship with others that acknowledges, right, that there is trauma, that there is suffering, and that there's also the ability to move towards meaningful growth and connection. But we have to be honest, right? And it requires kind of a radical vulnerability, right? We have to take that risk and being able to say, I think I just tweeted about this about an hour ago, that we are under so much pressure to pretend that everything's fine, right? We have meetings on our calendars, we have deadlines, we have sort of things that we have to get done in a certain amount of time. It's a push, right? And it's kind of like a collective gaslighting, if you will. This push to pretend, but every once in a while we have to say, this is not normal. This is not okay. And it's okay if I'm not feeling okay in this moment. It's very overwhelming. So we need to name that. And then once we have named that and recognized what is sort of sitting with us, then we can be in a place where we can sort of see, well, where is the potential? Where are the possibilities? How can I grow and change as a result of the pain that I'm experiencing? This isn't easy, right? So the way that I laid it out, it's like, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, but this isn't easy to do. So the first aspect of this trauma stewardship is, you could see at the top where it says North, creating space for inquiry, right? Why am I doing what I'm doing, right? Is this working for me? And the difficulty with this aspect, and I would say start here, is because we run away from ourselves, right? We often don't set aside time, even if it's 3 to 5 minutes every day, to ask yourself, what is important to me? Why am I doing what I'm doing, right? What do I need in order to continue the work that I'm doing? What do I need to nourish me in this moment? So even if I don't feel hope, right, and inspired for the future, there are others who can do that for me or carry it for me until I can. So understanding the space for inquiry means that in order to have a present, to be aware, right, to witness first yourself and then for others, we have to understand and then tend to those wounds, right? I'm sure all of us at some point, right, has had some kind of injury. We needed a Band-Aid. We had to sort of clean it out and disinfect it. And sort of the way this manifests now, sort of emotionally and psychologically, is that many of us have these wounds that have been just festering for a long time. And we apply these Band-Aids or these temporary fixes, but we feel like we don't have time or that we're not worthy enough to really understand the depth of the type of healing that is required for us to be whole, right? The last thing I'll say is this, is that creating the space for inquiry, right, requires a self-awareness, right? And we can practice that by understanding what we're experiencing, what our emotions are, and what we have to honor about what is true about our experience. We can't deny it. We can't hide it. We can't run away from it. But when we confront it with the love and support of those around us, it's actually freeing, right? Because now we're not minimizing the degree to which we're trying to just process and understand everything that's happening. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure there's questions. But I want to encourage that space for inquiry, right, as a place to start.
I need for you to change the slide that's up on the screen
To
the next slide. I don't know.
This one. Want me to go forward or back?
Forward, because we're still seeing how are you.
Yes. So,
but I have a question.
Yes.
And pre-COVID, our days and our tasks kind of had boundaries.
Yes.
You know, you get up. If you're a young mother like you get your kids ready, you do breakfast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get in the street to go to work. You adjust your mind to being at work.
Right.
You have a break, you have lunch, you have more work, you leave, you're back in the streets to get home, pick up children or not, etc. Boundaries.
Yes.
COVID brought in a boundless society where
I agree.
people don't feel empowered to set boundaries. Every Zoom meeting I have to be in.
Yes.
If my work takes my Zoom meetings till 10 o'clock at night, I got to be there. So there's a neglect of the family.
Yes.
There is a neglect of the self. The boundaries are all gone. So stuff flows into each other. And the kind of mental burdenness that you're talking about sets in quickly.
Yes, I absolutely agree. So here's where I think we can, and this isn't easy to do. I'm not a naturally optimistic person. I'm very pragmatic. And so, there's this idea of like toxic positivity. People would say like, everything is be fine. Just don't give up. Like, you're so strong. I think sometimes that actually puts more pressure on people when we need what we're feeling now validated. And so what you're speaking to, I think, has contributed to the burnout, right? Because there were these discrete moments in time, right, that you can say, perhaps on my commute, right, it offers a transition from one role to another. It
Mhm.
offers a transition from one sort of space,
Mhm.
right, that is being required of you, perhaps mentally. And so
Mhm.
now everything is just all smushed together and jumbled up,
Right.
right? And so here's what I found, where we can create our own boundaries, and perhaps this is what the moment requires, right? Maybe we were on autopilot before, right? And now we have to ask ourselves, what is important and why?
Right.
What nourishes me and why? And so when we give ourselves the boundaries, right, whether it's saying, that sounds like a fantastic invitation, I'm going to have to decline, right? Or it's using prayer, like the 5 daily prayers, as sort of a punctuation,
Right.
right? And so, before I move on to my next task, I spend these 5-10 minutes just kind of getting back in touch with myself, right? Because we can lose it.
Right.
Um, and I think what we also have to do, around boundaries, is understand perhaps what we learned or not, right, from our family of origin, right, around what feels good for you, right, what feels burdensome, what feels difficult, and why. And so when we have to ask ourselves, when I would agree to certain things, is it because I'm a people pleaser? Is it because I've never learned how to say no? Is it
Right.
because, placing these boundaries in some ways butts up against even my identity, right? And I'll speak specifically to Black women, right? Always being perceived as always nurturing, always available, always there for people. She'll give you the shirt off her back, right? And the question I always have is that, then is she naked? If she's giving you the shirt off her back,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so when people struggle with boundaries, sometimes it's because there's a real clash between how we're socialized to behave and what is actually healthy for us, right, in the short and long term. So this is why the space for inquiry is so important, is really being intentional and deliberate about understanding the self, right, and what is motivating, and what is motivating my behavior, and what is also posing a barrier to me being as healthy as I can in this moment.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm just loving this. We're going to take a break, which I don't want to do, but I must. This is Professor Aminal Dean, and I'm having a wonderful time being taught by Dr. Camilla Rashad. And this is Critical Talk on Muslim Network TV. And we'll be right back. This is Professor Aminal Dean talking with Dr. Camilla Rashad on Critical Talk and Muslim Network TV. And I want to pick up on a few things you said, but I guess I want to explore. What do I want to explore? Um, I mean, the endless, future of COVID and all of its variants. If we don't move to get ourselves as best we can, um, situated.
Mm-hmm.
Realize what we can do and what we can't do. Learn how to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Learn how to be honest with ourselves. If you ask me how I am, I don't say alhamdulillah. I give you a litany of what's wrong today. And what I find is that people don't want to hear that, especially Muslims. They want you to say alhamdulillah and I'm weathering the storm. But I want to go back to issues of race inside of our community.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see proliferating is there's an immigrant side and then there's a Black Muslim side. I'm including the Africans and the Caribbeans. And services available on the immigrant side are expanding. Um, I know that there's a Black Psychologists Association, but they have no religious sensibility when it comes to us, because I know some of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, well, have you ever thought that your problem is because you're Muslim, you know? How do we encourage young people to see what you do as a valuable, critical baseline service for a community of the dispossessed, oppressed, and all the ESSs there are? How do we do that? How do we let them know that education, especially in medicine, and you're an offshoot of medicine, and psychology, is critical to the health and well-being of our communities?
You know, I think that's an excellent question, because what we have to be able to do is bridge the disconnect between the profession and the community. And it often takes, people, coming to a gathering like the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, and being able to meet.
When is the next one?
So this year, it's probably going to be virtual. It is July 20th.
I'll be
there. So we're going to be virtual, which is, for health reasons, but it has been such an incredible gathering for people who are not in the mental health field, but understanding that when you're talking about the health and well-being of Black communities, of Black Muslim communities, that we need an interdisciplinary approach. And so we have sociologists and lawyers, anthropologists, just community members who participate in these conversations, because I think the fear that people have is that if I study that, it will push me into pathologizing my own community, right? That I will only see sort of the deficits and what's wrong. But what we can use this knowledge to do is to demonstrate how we have actually used a lot of our spiritual and cultural resources to withstand, right? And to not just survive these circumstances, but in many ways, to be innovative, to, expand and challenge other people's thinking, right? I mean, when you think about how Black culture is, it comes out of just joy that could not be sort of destroyed within us. So I think having a balanced picture of the profession and what is possible is very much needed. And I think that this kind of service also has to be prioritized sort of not in word, but in actuality, right? And so when people think, well, am I going to take on a certain amount of student loan debt to be a psychologist, or am I going to go into another profession where I can make lots of money and, I can support my family? And so when you mention that there is comparatively a lack of services in the Black community, in the Black Muslim communities, I think is very difficult because of that, that there are systemic reasons why these kinds of activities are hard to fund. And we could probably have a whole conversation about that. But I think we have to, for ourselves, make the case for why this is important. That is, it's more than just sort of addressing anxiety, right? But it's related to healing, it's related to, how do I exist in the world, in the body that I'm in, right?
Right.
And not constantly feel assaulted, right? I was actually listening to a story today on NPR, and it was talking with writers of color, right? And this idea of trauma porn, right? That their stories always have to be related to, this poor downtrodden character and how they've overcome, and people are saying, well, there's more to our story than that,
Exactly.
right? And what one of the authors described was like this idea of narrative plenitude, right? If we had so many more stories, that we wouldn't have to sort of put such all of our eggs in one basket into this one story. And so that's what we have to do for our, that we have to begin to shape the narrative and tell stories that matter to us, but that also are able to demonstrate our full humanity, right? That we can laugh and joke. And this is what I love about the conference, that we can have like a very serious sort of cerebral conversation about family well-being, about intergenerational trauma. And then in the next minute, we're sitting at lunch, we're talking about who can play spades and who can't. We're talking about,
I
I
can
can't. I can't. So I'll just put it out there, don't take my black card. But we have been able to thrive by being full human beings, even when that was not, our full humanity was not recognized by others. So we absolutely need more researchers, clinicians, social workers, and people who understand the complexity of the communities that we're part of.
Okay, we have a question from out there. What resources do you recommend for anyone needing, everybody needs it,
Right.
psychological assistance?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. I would start with, if you have healthcare, right? Even if it's Medicaid, any kind of health insurance, understanding what will be covered, right? Because now, and it's not surprising, that therapists are in high demand, right?
Yeah.
And some will accept, won't accept insurance, and some of them will have sort of like, you pay a fee, per session. So one is first familiarizing yourself with what coverage you have, and then, maybe calling that customer service line, right, of your health insurance company and saying, this is what I'm looking for. Can someone, point me in the right direction? Starting with a directory from the Institute of Muslim Mental Health. They've been building a database of Muslim mental health professionals for some time. What we're doing at Muslim Wellness Foundation is developing a list of Black Muslim mental health professionals, because, as you recognize, there isn't sort of sufficient enough conversation about anti-Blackness within the Muslim community and how that impacts our emotional well-being, how it impacts who has access to services and when, and that even if, so what the question that's often posed to me is, I'm a Black Muslim, I want a Black Muslim therapist. And I'm like, that may not be possible.
Yeah.
So, so people will say, well, I'd rather have a Black therapist over a Muslim therapist. And to me, that signals something that's problematic, right? That if the Muslim is Black and the therapist is Muslim, but, is South Asian or of Arab descent, and they still, like, potential client still feels like this isn't a safe space for me either, then we have to think about, what conversations do we need to have as professionals, right? And what steps need to be taken to build trust within the community. So I would say start with those directories, and also understanding what is within the scope of the health insurance that you have and the coverage.
Let's toggle on over to the Wellness Foundation,
Okay.
because that's so very important. Talk to us a little bit about the Wellness Foundation and tell us how we can support you in that.
Mm-hmm. So the Muslim Wellness Foundation, I established actually 10 years ago in 2011. And the focus of our work began with reducing some of the mental health stigma, particularly around anxiety and depression. Addiction is something that we do not talk about enough. But we've since evolved into really helping people understand the impact of the context, right? So how do people understand oppression, white supremacy, poverty, anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, and that it has, right, a very detrimental impact on one's self-esteem, identity, emotional well-being. But we often minimize that, right? There might be pressure, externally for Muslims to sort of be this always smiling community, right? Look how helpful we are. Look how we are, resilient. We're contribute to the fabric of the country. And yet there is a way that 20 years, right, and more of just sort of post 9/11, constantly being under assault, right? That impacts,
Exactly.
right, your body, your mind, your spirit. And so a lot of our work has since moved to creating spaces and dialogue for people to be vulnerable, right? To be able to take off the mask and to say, these are the things that are impacting me. And what do I need in order to not just have support for myself as an individual, but as a family member, as a community member? And how do we leverage the strength that we already have in order to be well and to be whole? So many people may not find a therapist that they have a good relationship with. I would say if we looked at it as a pyramid, right, it's at the top where people have direct clinical services, right? At the bottom of that pyramid, the vast majority of people are going to be looking for faith-based support. They're going to be looking at community-based services. And so how do we provide even just a space, like a circle, right, for people who are marginalized and vulnerable to just talk about their experiences, right? To be able to have others witness, right? Not just sort of their worst moments, but also how they have persevered. Those spaces are often missing, but absolutely critical. So Muslim Wellness, through Muslim Wellness Foundation, established the Black Muslim Psychology Conference. And what we're planning, inshallah, for this year is to expand our work on racial healing to other members of the community. So there's effort to understand, well, what is the particular experience of South Asian Muslims around racial trauma, colonization, model minority myth, and how does that impact sort of how they see themselves in the world? We're really focusing also on white Muslims. It may seem surprising, but understanding that white Muslims as part of a group with racial privilege but religious minority status, what kind of sort of structures do we begin to replicate within the Muslim community, because white supremacy hasn't been addressed, right? And so we want to expand this year in terms of offering those conversations for community members to think about who they are, who they're trying to become, and what they need in order to be on a path, right, a process of healing, particularly in this moment.
This is going to be wonderful. I'm. When is July? What month is this?
We're only in February.
I'm thinking about, many African Americans way back when, 40 years ago, 45 years ago, did not expect to meet a hardened racism in Islam.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
They met it, they didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
They figured, if I send my kid to an Islamic school, then they're going to learn Islamic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to send my kid to a public school, because then I have to figure out where they're going to learn the Islamic stuff. So as I was speaking earlier today with a woman in the community, I sent my kid to the school that was closest to me, which happened to be an Arab-run school. And they met a racism that was equivalent to white supremacy that we talk about. And how did that affect their psyche?
In profound ways, because so the subject of my doctoral research and kind of continued research is understanding the intersection of race, religion, and identity. And, what I explored specifically was around emerging adults. And so those young people between ages of 18 and 25. And what they shared with me is that there is a particular kind of betrayal that they feel when they encounter anti-Blackness within their spiritual community, right? Because there's possibly less ways to distance, right? I mean, you may say like, well, I live in a predominantly Black Muslim neighborhood, or there's a way that I can kind of put some boundaries between me and, maybe that majority white person. But what happens when those microaggressions happen to you when you're at an iftar, right? When you're standing next to someone who says that we are both, believers in this faith and brothers and sisters. So there's a particular kind of wounding that is experienced when it's, someone who we believe should have an understanding of what it means to be a marginalized person, who's then enacting, right, or transgressing against you because of who you are. So what I think really should be a focus of more, right? Not just sort of the responsibility of Black Muslims, but everyone to educate themselves on how white supremacy is internalized, how it is then manifested, right? In very sort of paternalistic and condescending ways.
I hate that paternalism. I got to get undressed. How long you been Muslim? Are you serious? I mean, my grandson called me up. Mom, somebody asked me, when did I convert to Islam?
Mm-hmm.
He's a third generation Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
But because he's Black, you must have, there is this master narrative that surrounds us that, I'm going to take a sledgehammer to.
Well, we need more people to take a sledgehammer to it. And that takes, so on the one hand, there's like awareness, right? There's skills that people can acquire, but I think it really starts with people taking a hard look at themselves, right? In order to say, for instance, we're talking about South Asian Muslims and, immigrating here. And now you also have second, third generation born in the United States. But what has become the trade-off, right? It's embracing, right, anti-Blackness, embracing the belief in Black inferiority in order to aspire to essentially what is whiteness, right? And so
they did that at home. I remember being in Pakistan, huge billboards, gory this and that and the other, and skin lighteners and treating their own ethnic group who had a little bit more color like trash.
So, and I think those are, some of that is cultural elements, but also just manifestations of how global anti-Blackness is and white supremacy. And so when we think about, right, present day, about a third, almost 28% of American Muslims identify as Black or African American, right? That's a significant number of people. But we don't, in representations of who American Muslims are, they often don't look like you and I, right? Unless it's a sports figure, entertainer, which mirrors, right, some of the tropes around Black people in general. But we need to understand, like, and I think particularly as Muslims, how this impacts our connection to the Creator, how it impacts our spirituality, and what are we going to be responsible for or answering to on the Day of Judgment, right? If these things are not addressed, I think plainly, and there's a commitment to action. And so I think for those who are uneducated, right, it's understanding why, for some, like my parents who converted to Islam, that Islam represented, right, liberation from anti-Blackness. It represented kind of reclaiming something that was lost. And so for there to be constant sort of tests of authenticity, right, tests of legitimacy, that speaks to an ignorance at how integrated and woven into this country Islam is. I think it's really no coincidence that researchers will point to about a third of enslaved Africans being Muslim, and here you have present day a third of American Muslims identify as Black or of African descent. So what is that telling us, right, about the opportunity that it presents? Right.
You know what I'm going to do, because we're winding down, and this hour has gone too darn fast. I had to run, and I don't run. Dr. Kameelah, and she was so gracious in agreeing to be on the show. I would like in the future, and please give my apologies to your children for taking some of their time to be with me on this show, especially the 5-year-old. Tell her I love her, I don't know her, I love her. To talk about the various hegemonies that surround us.
Yes.
If you would be willing to have that conversation with me. And let me give you 30 seconds to leave us with something.
Oh, wow. So if there is anything that folks take away from tonight, is creating that space for inquiry, right? Acknowledge your feelings, acknowledge, even if you don't know quite what it is, to spend some time with yourself, right? Stop avoiding yourself, perhaps. You don't like what you see. But even if it's a minute or two, right, to ask yourself, what am I feeling today? What might I need today? What should I ask for? Someone actually, a question I saw was, well, what if you can't find a therapist? What can you do?
Right.
What I ask people to consider is, who knows when you're in distress? Right? We do such a masterful job of pretending to be okay, hiding. Yes. So who knows when you're in distress, and who can you ask for help, right? And if we have the answer to those two questions, that might be a start. But it really begins with being honest with ourselves first, right? That no man, woman, anyone is an island, and that we need to ask for the support of those who love and care for us.
This is Professor Amina Al-Din. I have had, oh God, a wonderful hour learning from Dr. Camilla Rashad on Critical Talk, which is a program of Muslim Network TV. She has agreed, and she might say no because she's learned how to say no now, to come back, and we're going to talk in the future about the hegemonies that surround the African American Muslim. I would ask all of you to go on the website for Muslim Wellness, join, donate, do something.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much.